Coronations have been celebrated from as far back as 1066. The event in which someone is to be crowned is an occasion that brings extreme joy, but is also an occasion that brings extreme tension to the country.
Personally, I think he is a sign of modern democratic times. I do not think that the Church should interfere in matters of state.
I am a chauffeur by profession. After all, the king is a man like myself, but he should not allow his private life to interfere with his public life.
He wasn't a good king in the sense that he didn't have a great sense of responsibility. I mean, he used to drive his courtiers mad with the constant riposte, "Can I get away with it?" He hated the puffed up succès, the elevated sense of who he was.
The job of a monarch is one that requires great precision. The monarch is expected to have the country's best interests at heart, but this comes with a rewarding risk of sacrifice.
Now, psychologists have sought to try and explain the stammer in relation to the fraught relationship that the royal children had had with the king, with their father, George V, growing up. The young Bertie growing up had been almost terrified by his father and the expectations that his father had imposed on him.
Most monarchs live their whole lives destined to sit on the throne. However, others have the prospect of being king or queen thrust upon them.
The second son is not in any way reared to step in. He is the second son. The heir is really conditioned and expected to become king and grows up with a sense of their destiny and all that entails. And the brother never really thinks that they are going to become king. With both George V and Bertie, George VI, it was a seismic shock, and there's a great adjustment that has to happen with that.
With the death of Queen Elizabeth II, let's take a look back at coronations in recent history.
It was in Kenya, at the Royal Hunting Lodge, that the news of the king's death reached his daughter.
Elizabeth came to the throne upon the death of her father, King George VI. She was on a trip with her husband Philip at the time that she received the news of her father's death. She was only 25.
When Princess Elizabeth received the news of the death of her father, she went into shock. As you would. I mean, she was shocked by his death because she thought he was getting better. Everybody within the family thought the king was getting better. He was at Sandringham, he'd been out shooting, he'd had a wonderful day, he was with friends. As Princess Margaret said much later in an interview, he died just as he was getting well. But of course he wasn't really getting well, they thought he was. So it was a huge shock to her. And it meant the end of her life as she knew it. She had 2 little children, a naval husband. They just started out, really, on their married life. And they just moved into Clarence House, which was their first real home. He was going to be posted to Malta. Their life looked really rosy. And suddenly, basically, it ended.
We should like to see more of him, but the insatiable demand of the public has had to bow to the princess's very proper determination that her son shall not be spoilt by publicity. The public will be no less curious to see the first pictures of his brother, to compare the likenesses and note the differences.
The coronation was held more than 1 year later because of the tradition of allowing an appropriate length of time to pass after a monarch dies before holding such festivals. The one-day ceremony took 14 months of preparation. The first meeting of the Coronation Commission was in April 1952, 2 months after the death of her father. The coronation followed a pattern similar to the coronations of the kings and queens before her, being held in Westminster Abbey. But there were several parts of the ceremony that were markedly different. 27 million across Britain watched the coronation live on the BBC television service. It was the first coronation service to be televised in full and was the first to be broadcast internationally. The streets were covered with sailors, soldiers, airmen and women from across the British Empire and Commonwealth.
The coronation of the Queen was a huge and very significant affair. It was a 3-hour ceremony. It was, everybody recalls, the coldest June day that had ever happened, and it was pouring with rain. The army was enormous. Every sort of foot or 2 feet along the pavement, there was what they call street liners, which were soldiers, and they were all really cold, and they were given sugar lumps infused with brandy to sort of keep them going. And the ceremony itself was very, very serious and very religious and very dramatic. We won't ever have a ceremony quite like that again.
Guests and officials walked in a procession before about 3 million spectators who were gathered on the streets of London, some having camped overnight in their spots to ensure a view of the monarch, and others having access to specially built stands and scaffolding along the route. For everyone not present, more than 200 microphones were stationed across the path and in Westminster Abbey. 750 commentators were broadcasting in 39 languages.
She was very, very shy. She wasn't a great conversationalist. In fact, she didn't really have the necessary attributes to enter this world of men, but she had this extraordinary dedication to duty. She was determined that she was going to do it right, and she had no training. She just did what her father did. And that kind of, in a way, suited her character, because she could learn as she went along, but without doing anything extraordinary. So she just did dutifully, really, what she was told most of her life. And I think it was really only in her latter years that we saw the essence of the Queen's character. We saw her humour, we saw her laughter, we saw her acerbic wit. It was always there, but she belonged to an era where public persona had to be completely straight and untactile. So we never saw that side of her, so we assumed that she was very dull and boring. But she wasn't, but she was very shy, and it had been drilled into her that you mustn't show emotion in public.
Queen Elizabeth II became the longest reigning monarch in British history, having sat on the throne for 70 years, from 1952 to 2022. She became a very dutiful queen, much like her father George VI, and was devoted to being loyal, steadfast, and appreciated. She was the first monarch to have been served by 15 UK prime ministers, beginning with Winston Churchill in 1952, as well as many prime ministers from across her realms.
For within the palace, the Queen prepares to ride to Westminster. And now to herald her, the trumpets ring out.
Well, the Queen got on very well with her first Prime Minister, who was Sir Winston Churchill, and they really used to laugh together. And of course they had the mutual love of horses and racing, so that was an immediate leveller. And I think that Churchill treated Elizabeth as a little bit of a sort of daughter. He was very, very close to her, and they had a wonderful relationship. Probably, in fact, she says, it was the best relationship with any prime minister she's ever had. I feel that, everybody knows that the Queen's greatest passion was racing and breeding. She was a complete expert on breeding racehorses, knew all the pedigrees, not just of her own horses, but of almost every other horse that was running. She had this extraordinary knowledge and this wonderful interest, and no one will be able to replace that. That was her main outlet. There was nothing more exciting to her than to see one of the horses that she'd bred win a race.
As head of state, she acted as a diplomat and hostess, welcoming over 110 presidents and prime ministers to the UK on official visits.
Well, the Commonwealth was really important to the Queen because it was the old empire, really. The empire became the Commonwealth, and it was her father that instigated the Commonwealth instead of the empire. And the Queen felt it was her duty, not business, duty, to pull that Commonwealth together and to really make it the Commonwealth of Nations, which it became. Prince Philip used to say, it's her baby, it's her family, and it was.
Queen Elizabeth visited her North American realm for the first time since ascending the throne. Canada summoned up a regal display of pomp and ceremony to hail the beloved ruler.
Every 20 minutes at least she had appointments. So there's all that kind of duties of kingship or queenship that go into your day, and that would take up her morning, and then in the afternoon she might be going on a visit. She had to be visible, television was still embryonic. She needed to see her people. Every monarch needs to see their people. And that's what she did. And then maybe in the afternoon she'd have an appointment with the dressmaker, she'd take the dogs round the garden, she'd then maybe be able to spend a bit of time with her children. It was a very rigid and exacting sort of day.
Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history. Her reign lasted for 70 years, from post-war austerity and the end of empire through the expansion of the Commonwealth. She helped preserve the institution of the monarchy during times of massive social change. At her coronation, the Queen repeated her pledge to serve her people and fulfilled it throughout her reign with a combination of skill and a sense of duty.
Her death was announced on the 8th of September 2022. Her eldest son Charles is now king, with an expected coronation date of the 6th of May 2023. He will be crowned alongside Camilla, the Queen Consort. It is likely to be shorter and smaller in scale than Queen Elizabeth II's 1953 coronation, with a wider range of religions represented. It intends to reflect on the monarch's role today and looks towards the future.
When it was finally announced that the Queen had died, there was an extraordinary outpouring of grief. The majority of the Queen's subjects had never known another monarch. It was kind of the end of an era. It wasn't just her death, it was the end of an era. It was end of the Elizabethan age as we know it. And of course it was all so dramatic and so beautifully staged that made it even more poignant. The crowd, was crying. Or they were crying, or they were cheering, or they were just silent, completely silent. I think that probably the shock of his mother's very sudden death and him becoming king, when these things happen, you go into slight shock, so you act quite mechanically. It sort of protects you in a way. So I think he wouldn't have been overwhelmed at that moment. He would have been very emotional, but he would have kept it all in check. So I think he dealt with it on a very professional level, which would be really the only way to deal with something of that enormity happening to you.
On behalf of all my family, I can only offer the most sincere and heartfelt thanks for your condolences and support. They mean more to me than I can ever possibly express. And to my darling Mama, as you begin your last great journey to join my dear late Papa, I want simply to say this: thank you.
He cares about his country, he cares about its heritage, he cares about the planet, and he cares about the people. And I think that's really the attributes you need for a king. He is perfect. With Camilla at his side, I think he is going to be wonderful and compassionate and understanding and all the things that he needs to be. He has real heart. The coronation will be a lot shorter than the Queen's, in keeping with the time. It will probably be just over an hour. It'll be smaller and it will be cheaper, which of course is very important. But I still think it will have the pomp and circumstance that Charles loves so much, and we all love so much. That unity of military and horses and soldiers and precision that we have, and the coronation will be very, very much part of that.
Elizabeth's father, George VI, came to the throne upon his brother's abdication in 1936. As the second son of the Queen, he was not expected to inherit the throne. He spent his early life in the shadow of his elder brother, Prince Edward.
Edward VIII was the fast-living prince. He was excited by change and innovation. As a man, he engaged in lots of outdoor pursuits, things like flying, golf, skiing, swimming. He was a real sort of showman in that respect. It was also the case that he enjoyed sort of the fast life and nightclubs and partying. He'd go out socializing, drinking with his brothers. He also enjoyed the company of women. He had a number of extramarital affairs. He was the bad boy prince, but he was loved by the public.
Edward VIII is quite a difficult man to really pin down because in many ways he was very spoilt, he was very indulged. He was the opposite of his father, who had duty inbred in every pore, whereas with Edward, duty was drilled into him, which he really resented. So he wanted to be more spontaneous. He definitely was more modern. He was a product of his upbringing. He was both spoilt and neglected. He was both, in a way, modern, but also he still used his rank when he could. So ultimately, I think he was a selfish, stupid man.
Prince Edward, who later became Edward VIII, was quite possibly the most unsuitable man who ever became king. Everything about his character was entirely unsuited to the role of a monarchy. But this could be seen even as a young man, because from his university days at Magdalen College, Oxford onwards, he was somebody who escaped from this rather chafing boundary that he found himself under, because his parents had essentially told him all of his young life, you are going to be this dutiful prince, you are going to be king, you are going to do this, you're going to do that. By the time that Edward was of age, he had a simple answer to this: no, I'm not. And I suppose it was this tension between his upbringing and the values that had been instilled in him by governesses, by his parents, by courtiers, by all those around him, and his own inclinations that later spelt disaster both for him and nearly for the country.
Just before midnight, on January the 20th, 1936, King George VI's father had died at Sandringham, in Norfolk, England. His health had gradually declined over the previous few months, because of a chronic lung issue that first appeared in 1928. He managed a last meeting with his Privy Council and Secretary before he grew too weak to continue. Upon his father's death in 1936, his eldest son, Edward VIII, became king. He was a poor king, with matters really in the wrong hands.
The relationship between Edward and his father, George V, was particularly fraught. The two men did not see eye to eye. Edward had a very specific way of doing things. He wanted to do things differently. George, on the other hand, was old-fashioned, backward-looking. He was always on his son's back as well, checking in on him, wanting to know and get updates as to what it was his son was doing. Edward didn't like this kind of invasive behavior from his father, and the two fell out about it.
He greeted his father's death with absolute hysteria, and he was throwing things around and shouting and unable to respond to it. And I think a lot of people thought this was a very bad omen of what was to come, and they were proved right. Because Edward VIII is, in my opinion, the worst king who ever sat on the throne. He was somebody of quite a staggering self-absorption, mixed with a little light treachery.
He tried to cut back on much of the ceremonial normally associated with the monarchy. He, for example, reduced the spectacle that attended the proclamation ceremony when he became king. Equally, he sought to cut back what would be his coronation as well, and take parts of that out that he didn't agree with, that he thought were overlong and boring. As a king, Edward took his role quite seriously, certainly when it came to being out and about in amongst his subjects. When he'd been Prince of Wales, Edward was very active, going out into villages, towns, cities, meeting, greeting ordinary working-class people. There was a great deal of affection for him among the British public because he had this special, intimate relationship with them. This continued when he was king. However, in terms of the business of government, he was less dutiful. He wasn't as exacting as his father. He wasn't as committed to going through government papers, to signing those off. Often courtiers would come home and find government documents covered in sort of stains from wine glasses and that sort of thing. He didn't take that work as seriously as he should have done.
The Prince of Wales makes his last official appearance in Stockholm to inaugurate the city's new golf course at Shavinga.
Edward fulfilled his duties as a prince, as a young man, as the Prince of Wales, incredibly well. He was good-looking, he was charismatic, he was dashing. The people adored him. As Prince of Wales, he visited 45 countries in 6 years. He travelled 150,000 miles. And at one trip to Canada, he even damaged the tendons in his hand. He called it pump handling when he had to shake everyone's hand. And he really tried his best within the constraints of his character to honour the position of his role, and he was incredibly popular. I mean, he was a celebrity. He had tremendous good looks and tremendous charisma.
The Crown Prince of Sweden.
Tragedy of Edward VIII is actually he was incredibly popular as a king with his people. I mean, for instance, when he was Prince of Wales and he would go on royal tours, he liked to wear a bowler hat, which his father was furious about and felt it was very disrespectful that he didn't wear a top hat. He wasn't actually doing it to cock a snoop at the establishment. What he was doing was trying to be more familial and blend in with the common man.
He showed impatience with court protocol, and only months into his reign, a crisis was caused by his proposal to marry Wallis Simpson, an American who had divorced her first husband and was seeking a divorce from her second. The Prime Ministers of the United Kingdom opposed the marriage, arguing a divorced woman with 2 living ex-husbands was completely unacceptable as a future Queen Consort. Additionally, such a marriage would have collided with Edward's status as head of church, as the rules at the time disapproved of remarriage after divorce if a former spouse was still alive.
Wallis was vivacious, intelligent, charming, she was sharp-witted, and she didn't suffer fools. I think one of the reasons why Edward became so enamored with her was that she never talked up to him. She never saw him as a superior. She saw him as an equal, and he liked the fact that she had this kind of democratic persona where she treated everybody equally.
Did he strike you as being a very conventional kind of Englishman or as a very different kind of Englishman?
No, he struck me as being with it at that time.
What kinds of things now made you feel that about him?
I think he was ahead of his time. I think he had lots of pep, and I think he was very much ahead of his time. I think he wanted to establish things that were a little not ready for them, really, perhaps.
From early on, it was clear that Wallis was an intelligent young person, but found herself by the age of 20 married to her first husband. That relationship broke down because of the long absences the two spent apart, mainly because he was away on active service. During those periods, she'd engaged in various extramarital affairs, so it already demonstrated that she wasn't necessarily committed to the Christian version of marriage. After her first divorce, she married Ernest Simpson, a successful businessman, and really it was at this point that she started engaging in a wider, more glamorous social circle. She became a well-known society figure in the United States. She spent a lot of time traveling with her husband to Europe, to Britain, where she met with the great and good. Again, the relationship wasn't a brilliant one. His business started to collapse. The lifestyle that the couple aspired to couldn't be sustained with the money that he was making. So again, she started to look further afield and eventually would set eyes on the young Prince of Wales. People expressed different opinions on Wallis when she first got involved with Edward. Some saw her as essentially as a gold-digging figure, interested in tapping into Edward's wealth and power. Others saw her as just Edward's most recent craze. They didn't take her particularly seriously. As it became clear that he was besotted with her, they saw that she really meant a great deal to him, and in that respect, I think they were happy also for the king, that particular group of people.
Edward knew that the government would resign if the marriage went ahead, which would have forced a general election and would have ruined his status as a politically neutral monarch. When it became clear to Edward that he could not marry Simpson and stay on the throne, he abdicated.
There was a lot of pressure on Edward to either give up the throne in order to marry the woman he loved, or give up Wallis Simpson. And that pressure came from, notably, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, representative of course, the British nation, but also of the Commonwealth governments as well. There was also a lot of pressure coming from Cosmo Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who advised both Baldwin and Edward that it would be very unbecoming for Edward to stay on the throne and marry this woman who was twice divorced.
It's a really interesting question, was the abdication a difficult decision for Edward? Because in one sense it wasn't a difficult decision at all, because the thing that he was most clear about was that he could not be an effective king without the support of the woman he loved.
Brings him strong support from those who look up to him. There are differences of opinion too. Here are some of the views expressed.
My opinion of the king, he should marry who he loves. He's been a good chap to the working class. That's my opinion of him.
Quite apart from the fact that she isn't of noble blood, Mrs. Simpson has twice been in the divorce courts. To my mind, that completely rules her out as Queen of England.
The nation is behind him, and we must not lose him.
Personally, I think he is a sign of modern democratic times. I do not think that the Church should interfere in matters of state.
I am a chauffeur by profession. After all, the king is a man like myself, but he should not allow his private life to interfere with his public life.
In my opinion, the king's marriage should be a private act and considered as such. In this case, we should be able to avoid a constitutional matter. But I ask myself why the Baldwin government has forced an issue which cannot possibly be decided until next April. In my opinion, it is a possible explanation that they are concerned with the growing popularity of the king.
King Edward VIII, centre of the greatest storm in Britain since the World War. Opposed to the popular ruler's desire to marry Mrs. Wallis Simpson, strides Premier Stanley Baldwin, spokesman of the old school, bulwark of conventional England. No marriage to Mrs. Simpson, Stanley Baldwin says, speaking for the British government.
Here he is in typical action.
Government is a great idea.
Today, in Britain's new crisis, the Premier proves that he has lost no force. Mrs. Simpson replies with a formal offer to give up the king, withdraw from the tempest which sweeps the empire, leave Edward safe upon his throne.
Edward VIII's abdication speech will go down in history as one of the most iconic and moving speeches ever made.
He announced his decision to abdicate in a farewell broadcast heard by 150 million people around the world. The radio message put an end to the crisis in England that began when the king announced his marriage to an American divorcee, Mrs. Wallis Simpson. Parliament passed a special bill legalizing the abdication.
This is Windsor Castle, His Royal Highness Prince Edward. But at long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything. But until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. And now we all have the new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the king.
People were listening to it all over the country, they were weeping. It was a huge national moment because no king had ever abdicated before. And the fact that he was doing so for love, or at least what appeared to be love, made people feel this was a great sentimental passion. And I think what it did, and I think that there's always been a romantic way of looking at the abdication crisis, is that Edward had acted in a way that, on the one hand, was appallingly entirely selfish. On the other hand, it was a way that has torn up centuries of precedent. All of his forebears had essentially known that to be king was something that you did as a duty, your personal feelings didn't really matter. So what he said was actually, no, my feelings and my happiness are more important than my being king.
With a reign of 325 days, Edward was one of the shortest reigning British monarchs to date. He was never crowned king. His expected coronation date was to be on the 12th of May 1937. Preparations had already begun, and souvenirs were on sale when Edward VIII abdicated on the 11th of December 1936. This, instead, became the coronation date of George VI.
Edward's relationship with his younger brother Bertie was very warm when they were younger boys. There was very little between them in terms of their age, and they grew up best of friends. However, as the two men grew older, life became a bit more difficult. George had a very specific way that he wanted to live. He was much more of a kind of private figure. He was more withdrawn in terms of his public image. He didn't have the sort of the charisma and the glamour that was possessed by his older brother Edward.
George VI, when he was a younger man, was devoted to his wife Elizabeth, the Queen, and to their children Elizabeth and Margaret. He was not somebody who was seeking the limelight. He was not somebody who wanted to have his name up in lights. He was somebody who would have much preferred a quiet, simple family life.
We know that Bertie, as as Edward's younger brother, was very anxious about becoming king. He wasn't a public figure on the same level as his brother had been. He wasn't very good in front of the cameras. He struggled to make speeches. He was a reluctant monarch in that respect, and he knew that becoming king would mean that he had to put his home life, his family, on the back burner, that he had to embrace duty, responsibility now first and foremost.
Reluctant to take the throne he did take.
In 1936, Bertie unexpectedly becomes king. This was a moment of great challenge for him in that he was something of a reluctant figure. He had been up until this point a family man. He enjoyed his private home life away from the media, away from the cameras. He knew from this point forward that this would all become and be put on public show, and that he'd had to embrace a new path that required that he put duty and public service ahead of all else.
George VI, or Bertie as he was known, was absolutely terrified at the idea of becoming king. It was something that he'd never wanted. He had a debilitating stammer, which meant that any kind of public speaking was nearly impossible for him. And it was with complete fear that he watched the rise of the abdication crisis, because he did not want to be king. He wanted to have a quiet, blameless life as a husband, a father, somebody who was a royal prince who's stammered his way through speeches he had to give, but he never ever wanted responsibility of actually ruling. And so he was looking at his brother and begging him not to abdicate, but Edward wasn't interested because his attitude was very bluff. It was to pat his brother on the back and say, "Never mind, old man, you'll do this much better than I ever did." So when he became king, it was with an almost impossible set of expectations. How on earth do you follow somebody who has not just been this popular, trend-setting figure, but who was given up before and abdicated? I mean, how do you follow that?
George was married to Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the youngest daughter of the Earl and Countess of Strathmore, with whom he shared two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret.
Bertie found his closest confidant and greatest supporter in his wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon.
Now Paramount News shows the King and Queen and their lovely daughters in rare and intimate poses. They are the most talked-of family in the world. But for today, the King is simply the happy father, photographing the little princesses for his personal motion picture library.
His relationship with his wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who later became Queen Elizabeth, was, one doesn't want to sentimentalise these things, but it was a very happy relationship. The two of them had known each other for many years, very, very much in love. It was a very conventional match. I mean, unlike Edward and his various mistresses and Ben Wallace, there was no question that they would get married. They got married and had two daughters. And essentially, it gave him a stability and a happiness that he'd always wanted.
Bertie had a particular passion for Margaret. It was always said that Elizabeth was his pride and Margaret was his joy. Margaret understood his temperament. Margaret was terribly spoiled. I mean, she was a complete daddy's girl, but she was the only one who could soothe him when he got into what the family called one of his terrible gnashes, his kind of anxious, frustrated rages. And Margaret would be the one who could sort of tickle him out of those with humour and love and jokes.
George VI's coronation at Westminster Abbey took place on the 12th of May 1937, the date previously intended for Edward's coronation. In a break with tradition, George's mother Mary had attended the ceremony in support of her son. The day of his coronation was a huge event. Staff on duty started work at 4 a.m. and guests began to arrive at 6 a.m., many peers carrying sandwiches in their coronets. At 9:30 in the morning, the procession of the Regalia started. The Regalia are the items of royalty, specifically the crown, sceptre, and other ornaments. All of the items made their way from the chamber, through the cloisters, into the abbey. They were then placed in position for the service. Eyewitnesses recall this event to be one of much joy. It was said to be truly beautiful, and that there was colour everywhere, with blue and gold hangings, carpets, crimson robes and uniforms. Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret were with their grandmother, Queen Mary, watching the ceremony from the royal gallery. slight mishaps did occur during the service. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon Lang, who performed the ceremony, thought that the Dean had given him the crown, notably St. Edward's crown, the wrong way. A bishop had stepped on the King's train, and another put his thumb over the words of the oath when the King was about to read it. Nonetheless, the ceremony turned out to be one joyous yet important occasion, especially as this was the day on which George was once again the spare to the heir.
George VI's coronation on May the 12th, 1937 was overshadowed really by the abdication of his brother 7 months previous, and also the continued sort of speculation about the relationship involving Edward and Wallis. George was not a very popular king. He had been really out of the limelight in contrast to his older brother, and there was a lot of public disaffection with the monarchy in the first years of George's reign. Certainly there were a lot of comments recorded on the morning of the coronation by investigators that went out into Britain's towns, cities, notably also London, and they recorded members of the public talking about how they were sort of uninspired by the new king, how they worried about his psychological preparedness for the role. They were concerned about his stammer, whether he had the health to sustain himself as king.
The idea behind the coronation was it would be televised, and it would be the first coronation event that had been televised because it was felt that there should be greater transparency about the workings of such things. But there was enormous fear that George stammering on television would look horrendous, and so the Archbishop made sure that there were various precautions taken so nothing of that sort happened. But in the end, the coronation went absolutely fine, and the thing was that Churchill was watching it with his wife Clementine, and he said after he'd seen the king crowned, "You're quite right, it could never have been the other one."
George VI took the regnal name George VI to emphasise continuity with his father and restore confidence in the monarchy. At this time, the view of the monarchy was at an all-time low. The first half of George's reign was taken up by questions surrounding his predecessor and brother, whose titles, style and position were uncertain.
Bertie would take the name George VI specifically in order to associate himself with his father, who had been George V. The connection there in terms of the public image was key. He saw himself very much of a king in the vein of his father. In terms of the values he sought to exemplify as monarch, he was about duty, diligence, behaving constitutionally, in contrast with his brother, Edward.
George suffered from a stammer, which meant that public speaking was not his strongest suit, and this further resulted in feelings of inadequacy in his role of a monarch, both from him and the public. He took sessions with the speech therapist Lionel Logue, whose time with the king actually proved to be effective for him. Public criticism of George VI grew, and more people began to view him as unsuited to the role of king. His stutter and unwillingness to speak publicly did not sit well with his people.
With the increasing burden that is placed on becoming king, there are even greater concerns about the stammer and whether he can master this speech impediment in order to be able to make moving public addresses as was required of the king.
So the speech therapist that he hired, or rather was hired for him by his wife, was this man called Lionel Logue, who was not Australian. And Logue was very unconventional because he didn't believe that the way of dealing with speech therapy was to be formal about it. He dealt with the king, who he called Bertie informally, as if they were friends, as if they were working on the same level. And the film The King's Speech offered a fictionalised account of this, and it's broadly accurate in what it suggests, that there was this friendship that arose between them.
With some minor event. Would that be agreeable? Of course.
Yes, and that would be the full extent of your services.
Shall I see you next week?
I shall see you every day.
He managed to get Bertie going in terms of making public addresses. Bertie would practice day in, day out for at least an hour on strengthening his muscles around his vocal cords, in order to try and gain a greater sense of confidence and control over his voice. The speech therapy was very effective for Bertie in that he did gain in confidence. Notably, the impediment would never fully go away. Bertie would continue to stammer, but nevertheless, he became a much more confident and competent public speaker than he had been before.
As time went on, George had actually come out from the public eye much stronger. His reign saw the Second World War, which was a tragic time for the British public.
In this grave hour, perhaps the most faithful in our history, I send to every household of my people, both at home and overseas, this message, spoken with the same depth of feeling for each one of you as if I were able to cross your threshold and speak to you myself. For the second time in the lives of most of us, we are at war.
The King and Queen were very keen to emphasise a narrative that they, the royals, and the British public at large were all in this war together, that there was a sense of shared sacrifice that united crown and people.
What George did is he was faced with enormous responsibility and with enormous difficulties, and it was essentially a case of sink or swim. What he was able to do was he was able to actually grasp the nettle, and he was able to say, I have to be the king that Britain needs.
George was ready to do everything in his power, together with the British public, to fight this war together. He proved to be a very strong king, who didn't let things like his stammer affect his overall ability to perform as king. In fact, he faced these fears and worked day in and day out to come out stronger. George unfortunately knew that his life was short. Not only did he have a stammer, but he was a heavy smoker, and the stress of the war had taken a huge toll on his well-being.
George VI, who had, as a young man, often suffered from ill health, became quite ill as a result of the Second World War. The stress of the conflict told on him. He was a heavy smoker, and by 1945, his health was actually very poor. In the ensuing years, that health would deteriorate. A number of smoking-related diseases would afflict the king, to the extent where he would ultimately die prematurely in 1952.
I think that the legacy of King George is so strong precisely because it's contrasted against the legacy of his brother. So Edward is seen as somebody who jettisoned the throne of England, and George is seen as somebody who didn't want it, who sat on it and did his very best on it and brought great stability to the country, and also had this secure, tight family that played out so well with the British people. Edward did have a sense of that and did allude to that in his abdication speech, that they were in very safe hands with his brother, who had the love of a dutiful and warm wife and had this sense of family and would be a better king as a result.
Ever since his coronation, he had prepared Elizabeth to be the best possible monarch should the case arise in which George died before she was ready for it. The coronation of King George VI was an educational moment for Elizabeth. Painfully aware of how ill-prepared he was for his coronation, he wanted things to be different for Elizabeth when she would ascend to the throne. Elizabeth was only 10 at this time. The bond between her and her father was truly one of a kind. He had given her a writing assignment in connection to his coronation and hoped that this would become an indelible memory so that she could draw upon that for strength when her time eventually came. He'd take her out on an equal par with her sister Margaret, and this may well have contributed to the grace and humility for which Queen Elizabeth has become known when carrying out her duties. He had refocused Elizabeth's studies to be one that better prepares her for her reign. George had involved Elizabeth massively in his reign early on, leaving her to take on duties from him whilst he was away. There are a lot of happy, intimate moments between George VI and his daughter Elizabeth. He wanted to spend as much time as possible with his two daughters and did everything in his power to ensure their happiness, all while his health was rapidly declining.
If you're the heir to the monarch, there's always a sense of preparation to become king or queen. And from the moment Bertie became king, Elizabeth was queen in training.
He proved to be much of a different father compared to his own father, George V, who was described as being terrible. George V was King of the United Kingdom from the 6th of May 1910 up until his death in 1936. George's reign in the early 20th century saw some of the most dramatic changes, not only throughout British history, but across the globe. It saw the rise of socialism, communism, Irish republicanism, and the Indian independence movement, all of which had a massive impact on the British Empire.
George V was a very good king in the sense that everything that was integral to his being was about responsibility and duty and dignity, and he took his role very seriously. So I think from that point of view, the country, the people, felt very safe with their monarch, and so we could say he was a diligent, dutiful king.
George V was a king who had to deal with a series of crises that coloured his reign, ranging from the First World War to the rise of communism and fascism, the Great Depression, and latterly the fragmentation of the empire. He was a king who had to move with the times. He did so by presenting himself as a figure of duty, who took his responsibilities as king very seriously, who put the nation ahead of his own desires.
George came to the throne in a world at peace, except for distant thunders in the Balkans. As king, he attended to affairs of state, and as husband and father stayed at Windsor Castle with the Queen and their young children, Mary, Edward, and Albert. Later, the king invested his son Edward with the hereditary title of Prince of Wales. As the heir apparent received the crown, a new phase of history opened, and the king, with affection and pride, presented his son to his people.
For a man who was very much the spare to the heir, he came to his great destiny with a future barely mapped out. As a young man, there was little expectation that George would become king. He was the third in line to the throne at the time, after his father and his elder brother, Prince Albert Victor. As the second son of the heir apparent, Prince George was destined for a career in the Royal Navy. In 1877, he and his elder brother Albert Victor became cadets. George was only 17 months younger than Albert Victor. Given the closeness in age of the two brothers, they were educated together. They were brought up having a very close relationship. They served together on the HMS Pageantry and toured the colonies of the British Empires in the Caribbean, South Africa and Australia, amongst other colonies. When they returned to Britain, the Queen at the time, Queen Victoria, had complained that her grandsons could not speak French or German, and so they spent 6 months trying their best to learn another language. They were sent to Lausanne in a desperate attempt to broaden their foreign knowledge. After Lausanne, the two brothers were separated. Albert Victor was admitted to Trinity College in Cambridge, while George continued in the Royal Navy. He travelled the world, visiting many areas of the British Empire. In November 1891, George's elder brother Albert Victor became engaged to his second cousin, Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, also known as May within the family. In this time, Prince George had actually fallen in love with his cousin, Princess Marie of Edinburgh. His grandmother, father and uncle all approved of the match, but his own mother and Marie's mother were opposed to it. In November 1892, 6 weeks after the formal engagement of Albert Victor and Princess Mary, Albert died of pneumonia during an influenza pandemic, leaving George to now be second in line to the throne and likely succeed after his father.
I think it's really interesting that both George V and then George VI unexpectedly came to the throne. And I think that's very difficult because in these regal and aristocratic families, the heir is really conditioned and expected to become king and grows up with a sense of their destiny and all that entails. And the brother never really thinks that they are going to become king. So I think with both George V and Bertie, George VI, it was a seismic shock. And there's a great adjustment that has to happen with that.
King George V would have known growing up that he was the spare. His older brother was heir. He was always second in line in case anything happened to his older brother. This was a period when people would die unexpectedly. He had been trained as a member of the British royal family to possibly take the place of his brother. He'd gone on world tours of the empire. He'd spent time going around Britain fulfilling royal duties. So he understood what the role of king required of him.
George had only just recovered from a serious illness himself, having been confined to bed for 6 weeks with typhoid fever. Queen Victoria at this moment in time still regarded Princess Mary as a suitable match for her grandson, and George and Mary grew close during their shared period of mourning. A year after Albert Victor's death, George proposed to Mary and was accepted. They married on the 6th of July 1893 at the Chapel Royal in St James's Palace, London. Throughout their lives, they remained devoted to each other. George was unable to express his feelings easily in speech, but they often exchanged loving letters and notes of endearment.
Grandmother of England, they called her, whose mode of dress survived the changing times, who so precisely epitomized the dignity and grace that befit the ruling house of Britain. She came from royal stock, though a family of modest means, and from childhood was marked for the marriage that had Queen Victoria's blessing. At 26, she wed the man who was to become king in 1910. At the side always of George V, here in World War I, a marriage of love and devotion. They represented the last links with the Victorian age.
The death of his elder brother had put a stop on George's naval career. It was important that he now took more of an approach as a man destined to become king. The couple went on to have 5 sons and 1 daughter. His parenting style was different from that adopted by most people at the time. He actually adored his own father, Edward VII, but his own father's skills tended to be a lot different from those of Edward VII. George was claimed to be a strict father, to the extent in which his children were terrified of him. One of his own sons, Prince Henry, even went as far as saying that he was a terrible father in later years.
Well, George V was very different to his father, Edward VII, because he was a much more traditional figure. He was somebody who was much more interested in maintaining the integrity of a monarchy. He was somebody who essentially saw himself almost like Queen Victoria again, somebody who was going to come in and take this institution that was beginning to fall into disrepute and essentially make it great again. But what he was he wasn't a dynamic figure. I mean, he's often been called the most boring king ever to have ruled England, but he was the right person at the right time. So I suppose that we look at George V as somebody now who Because he wasn't this dynamic figure, he was in his own way somebody who did bring about change, but the change was that of stability.
While we can say that George V was definitely a good king, we cannot say that he was a good father. Edward VII's former mistress, Frida Dudley Ward, said that you could never blame Edward for his problems because he had had such a terrible time at the hands of his parents. And George and Mary were incredibly old-fashioned Edwardian parents, believing that children should be seen, even rarely, and not heard. Apparently, Frida Dudley Ward said of Edward that he had always said that he hated his father and his father was horrible to him. And while he loved his mother wouldn't let him love her, and that she always sided with the king. So it was an incredibly authoritarian, disciplined, cold, emotionally unrewarding childhood. While they had the trappings of wealth and incredible luxury, there was tremendous neglect. And even when the family had no visitors, in the evening they would dress for dinner in full regalia, in tiaras, in diamonds, but there was no emotional warmth. The children were educated by pretty mediocre governesses and tutors. Edward later said that he had a curious type of loneliness, that even though he had all these siblings, and even though they were brought up in royal palaces in Sandringham, in Windsor and Balmoral, all these places that we see as looking so splendid, there was actually tremendous emotional neglect.
King George V had quite a strained relationship, certainly with his sons. He was quite an old-fashioned figure. He was very much a Victorian. He was quite backward-looking and at first quite resistant to the change brought about by things like new technologies and developments in the mass media. His children, and particularly his sons, they were more forward-looking. They enjoyed exciting social lives. They were very active on London society scene. They parted with the great and the good. They lived very different lives to their father, and for that reason, there were tensions.
I think it's fair to say that Prince Edward hated his father. I think it's fair to say that he despised him for being this anachronistic, stuffy figure, and that he absolutely despised the idea that his father had been pushing him into this unsuitable garment, if you like, and that the garment of monarchy did not fit very well with him. He was a man who preferred dressing up in Savile Row suits to ceremonial robes. So I think that his loathing of his father was something that stayed with him all his life, and I think that actually when he became king, the circumstances of how he became king are quite muddy.
On the 6th of May 1910, Edward VII died and George became king. His coronation took place a year later, on the 20th of June 1911. His coronation was looked upon as being hugely significant, as it was the reign of a man who was actually the spare to the heir. The big day took place at Westminster Abbey on the 22nd of June 1911 and was celebrated by the Festival of Empire in London. He recalls in his diary that it was overcast and cloudy with some showers and a strong, cool breeze, but that it would be better for the people than great heat. He also recalled the service in the Abbey as being beautiful, but that it was a terrible ordeal. It was grand, yet simple and most dignified, and went without a hitch. He nearly broke down when David, the Prince of Wales at the time, came to do the homage to him, as it reminded him so much of when he did the same thing to his papa, and that he did it so well. He says that his wife Mary looked lovely, and it was indeed a comfort to him to have her by his side. They left Westminster Abbey at 2:15 with their crowns on their heads and scepters in their hands. He became a very dutiful king and inherited a constitutional crisis left behind by his father. He knew that his duty was to remain objective and neutral. He managed to navigate several crises during his reign, the First World War being one of these many crises. Unfortunately, George V's health declined over the years. By the end of his reign, the world had emerged as a very different place, with new challenges, and introduced a new social, political, and economic world of change.
George V was very much an old-fashioned patriarch. He was somebody who believed not just in the idea of spare the rod and spoil the child, but also in the very Victorian idea that children should be seen and not heard. So of his 4 sons, the 2 eldest, later Edward VIII and George VI, had a very difficult relationship with him because he was this cold figure and his wife, Mary, was cold as well. And there's very much a sense that everyone was brought up in a way to understand duty, and the idea of duty as the central tenet of what you were suspected to do as a royal prince was something that he laboured home intensively. And if we look at it now, we'd almost regard it as abusive, because we look at the idea that these children were being treated in ways that were not humane and were not kind. But on the other hand, back then, there was no concept of kindness as we understand it today.
Coronations have remained the same for more than 1,000 years. The British ceremony is the only remaining event of its type in Europe.
I think everyday life in 20th century Britain was completely different from life we experience today. I think there was a much stronger moral code, a far greater respect and reverence for the monarchy, and a sense that people led a much more ordinary and disciplined life in a way. There was greater sense of poverty, a greater sense of reverence for authority, and a greater respect for the church.
We have seen drama, tension and heartbreak, all happening behind the doors of Buckingham Palace.
Because he was so heart-led, it wasn't a difficult decision because his heart led the way. But I think in his head, obviously, there must have been conflict. And he loved his brother, and he knew the strain he was then going to be putting onto his brother. But as he said, Bertie was a better mould of king. He was going to be more dutiful. He had a more stoic, traditional wife in Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon.
We have had the role of a monarch thrust upon those that didn't think were capable to do the job. Yet the throne continued to be taken, and the job continued to be done dutifully, making another era, another century, just as impactful. This was the history of the coronations.